Welcome to our webinar this morning on ergonomic interventions that need interventions. The point of today's webinar is to chat with you a little bit about some things that we see or have seen over the last few years, what challenges the client has experienced and sort of what their steps were as they moved through the process in order to come up with an actual solution that worked, and also to talk to you about strategies for preventing that from happening in the first place. So we obviously don't want to create an intervention that doesn't work. We want to create an intervention or an ergonomic change that is super positive and healthy and addressing all of our ergonomic challenges. And so we're going to talk a little bit about the second half of today's webinar about how we are going to tackle that so that hopefully we don't end up in the situations that I'm presenting today. Before we get too far into that, I just want to take a second today. I know we spent a lot of time thinking and talking about coronavirus right now, and I certainly don't want to spend much time on that today. But I did think I'd be remiss if I didn't take a second just to acknowledge, first of all, our gratitude for you joining us today. We understand that you probably have a lot going on in your personal life and your work life. You may be working at home right now with kids in the background. Maybe you're still at work, having been deemed an essential service. No matter what your work location today, we are grateful that you joined us. We know we're all living in some difficult and strange times, and the team here at Ergonomics is no different. And so right now, our strategy at Pro is to strive to continue providing support and assistance with the virtual services that we can in order to support folks and workplaces during this pandemic ultimately. So if you haven't heard much about what we've been doing yet, I will share more with you at the end of the webinar today. So stay tuned for that, just letting you know what is out there as resources should you need it for your workplace. That is sort of the just overall message, not the focus of today, but we do want to talk about and highlight that we are available to help should you need it. So that will come at the end if you hang on with me until then. So the agenda for today is to talk very briefly about controls, because that is really the focus, is that we're making controls, hopefully for ergonomic challenges or problems we're seeing. Then we are going to talk about, or I'm going to present several different case studies or examples of client projects that have sometimes gone well, sometimes not, or sometimes gone partly well and partly not. And so talk about those and what their challenges were just based on what we've seen. And then finish up with that conversation, like I mentioned earlier, about strategies to avoid getting yourself into this situation in the first place. So that is sort of the plan or the map for today. Like I said, we're going to start with very brief chat about controls. By no means do I want to do this to death. I think we all know this quite well. But ultimately, that there is a hierarchy of controls. There are controls that are better than others. And ergonomic controls or controls for MSD hazards, which is really the issue here, is really focusing typically on sort of those three bottom ones: engineering controls, administrative controls, and PPE. And I would say we really focus our energy in that engineering controls and administrative controls section. PPE is pretty rare for ergonomics, but the other two certainly are used on a regular basis. So when I present some of the case studies today, we're going to look at controls related to both engineering and an example of an administrative control that didn't go so well, and then talk about how we can manage or mitigate some of the challenges associated with that. So some good, bad, and ugly examples, and then hopefully some light at the end of the tunnel. How do we avoid these in the future? So like I said, we're going to jump right in here and start talking about case studies because we don't need to spend a lot of time on controls. So I think I have 6 case studies, maybe 7, to present some just different examples that clients have been through in order to address their ergonomic challenges and what was the negative of their change, and then what their ultimate solution was as they worked through the problem that they were presented with. So the first one I wanted to highlight here is from a parts manufacturer that we worked with. So they make a lot of different parts, but this was one of them. And this is ultimately their first challenge that they needed to address, is that parts needed to be moved from station to station within a plant. So there would be one machine doing some part of the process, right? Machining out a piece of this actual product, and then it would get transferred to the next operator, a next piece of equipment, and then at that location it would get put through again, and another piece of the process would get implemented, and then they would get offloaded back onto a rack of some kind or into a cart, and they would get moved and moved and moved. And so one of their challenges was ultimately, how do we move these in the best way possible? As you might imagine, or as you likely seen if you've been in any kind of manufacturing plant, a pretty common process is to have like a big bin that has maybe fold down sides. Obviously, it can be on wheels. It cannot be if it's going to be moved by a forklift, for example, or a tugger. But it can be on wheels, cannot be on wheels, may or may not have fold down sides. And problem with those is they're often quite large, right? They're about the size of a skid, if you want to picture that in terms of size. And you would load all these parts flat down into them, which creates a lot of bending and reaching in order to access these part bins, especially when you talk about a skid, which is, reaching to the center of the skid is somewhere around 20, 25 inches. And so that's a pretty significant reach. And if it's on the floor, if it is like a bin on the floor that a forklift's going to pick up, it might be down to 6 or 8 inches, from the ground, which is pretty significant awkward posture of a bend and reach into the bin. So they didn't want to go that route with moving their parts. They were looking for a different solution. And ultimately they came up with the rack that you see in the picture there. This is a custom rack that they built or had built for their work site, and they had a whole pile of these made. And there's a couple different models depending on which part they're moving. But the idea is that they're stacking parts vertically. Problem solved, right? So problem solved was didn't want to reach into the racking. I didn't want to reach into a bin to lay parts down flat. And I didn't want to have to bend down to basically my ankle height or below my knee in order to place parts into the bin. So in theory, problem solved. They implemented all these carts and it absolutely eliminated most of the bending. There is still some reaching, but it's, reaching with just your arm. It doesn't include your back now, just to slide the part to the back of that pin that sticks out. And so problem solved. But what they started to find is that they were having some shoulder injuries. They were having some folks report some shoulder discomfort and or off on WSIB claims for shoulder injuries. And they'd never seen that before. That wasn't something that they'd had a lot of experience with. And so they started to explore what the challenge was or what was going on, what had changed, why were they seeing these new injuries crop up. And one of the things that they ultimately determined as we did an evaluation of the jobs and tasks that were, particularly the ones that had the injuries, is that we thought perhaps one of the challenges people were experiencing was that the cart actually, although effectively eliminated bending, created reaching over shoulder height. So now they were lifting these parts, often 2 or 3 at a time. They would grab a couple and then slide them on. And so they have a little bit of a weight there, so maybe 5 pounds-ish, and they would be sliding them onto these pins, and the height was up to 62 inches. So now we're talking about quite a ways above smaller female shoulder height. They were now reporting some shoulder injuries. So the first and immediate solution is let's explore whether this is the problem, and let's discontinue the use of the top row of the cart. So let's put up caution tape or something on that top row and eliminate it altogether. And then we need to explore 2 things. Number one is that actually going to effectively improve people's comfort? Were they going to change? The discomfort number is going to go down. And question 2 is, what did this do to the need for more carts, right? Because as soon as we eliminate the space for 20 odd parts on the top row, that means that we're going to need 8 more carts or 12 more carts or however many it was going to be. And so we need to explore both of those new problems that were going to be presented and figure out how that was going to impact the overall comfort of the staff and ultimately generate what the cost would be to replace to provide new carts for the ones that to handle the extra parts that were no longer being stored on the top rack. So in the end, they actually determined that their discomfort scores did go down. They were looking at a decreased reduction in injury statistics. And so they decided that actually lowering the cart height made a lot of sense. And they had some in-house resources that were able to do this effectively. So the cost to change their carts or modify them was almost non-existent. They ultimately just had their engineering and maintenance crew cut off the top row. So they didn't even say, well, let's tape it up and not use it. We're actually going to modify the cart and eliminate it. And ultimately they did have to buy a few more carts, but it did manage their injury risk and injury reporting, which we all know that the cost of an injury is significant. So a change like that, adding an extra 10 carts, for example, was easily outweighed by the cost of one ergonomic injury one ergonomic shoulder injury in this case. Right, so just an interesting example. It did solve one problem, all this bending into the cart, no more bending and reaching with no low back issues, but inadvertently created some shoulder problems. And they learned that by the time, claims came around to people reporting some claims. The next example I want to share is a case study of a project that I worked on and off for a long time, actually. And I'm going to highlight this as a good example of how how we can mitigate or manage and ward off some of these issues. Specifically, this client implemented a very cool, very custom lift assist device, right? That they were lifting, for lack of a better, you don't need to know all the details, but for lack of a better description, they had to lift very heavy and awkward parts or pieces off of a rack. So they were stacked quite high, and the parts were upwards of 85 pounds. And so they were big. So they actually had two staff members lifting them off this rack, and then they had to flip some of them over. And it was just, it was not an easy process from an ergonomic perspective. It created all kinds of challenges. So they went through the process of implementing a custom lift assist. It worked great, right? It effectively one person now was able to lift each part out of the racking, regardless of the height. The lift assist would turn the parts over when it was needed. So it actually had full rotation ability. It could position all the pieces into place where they needed to be in the system for actual processing. But as part of the process, they implement this really great lift assist, but it does a lot of things. So ultimately what happens is it has a lot of buttons. And so this is an example. There were two handles that looked exactly like this. And so the picture on the left is what we found when we were doing an assessment before it was actually installed on site. So this is during the development phase. They had actually built parts of it or were building it off site. They had us come out and do an ergonomic assessment on it, evaluate the risk, look at the ergonomics. This client's really focus was that they did not want this lift assist to arrive on site with ergonomic problems, because that was the whole point of doing it in the first place, was to eliminate the ergonomic problems. So really great, was serving all their movement needs, right? Was able to handle all the parts, move them, flip them, turn them, do everything that they needed to do. But when we were on site, what we discovered is, if you can see in the left-hand picture of those controls, that's my hand, and I can hardly reach the button with my thumb, right? The far right-hand button there. And that is true for both handles. Both handles were designed the same way. My thumb could hardly reach the end control. And unfortunately, that button, that number 4 button, is one that you use for all kinds of different purposes. You use a combination of the toggles for different pieces. That button you used for a lot of different things, and I could barely reach it. And so that became the sort of intervention was really great. The lift assist is doing exactly what it needs to do, but a component of this intervention, specifically the design of the handle, was causing us some limitations. Staff were not going to be able to comfortably reach the thumb button, the thumb toggle, and there was some concern that it would create some hand and or thumb injuries. Obviously the goal is to have zero ergonomic injuries after implementation of a major change like this. So the solution was actually to come back to the engineering firm that was building it and retool the handle. So you can see on the right hand side in the red handle picture, it's exactly the same layout, but they have shrunk. They've actually, instead of changing the handle layout, what the engineering team did here is actually move the position of the handle. They removed it and welded it back on further to the right so that you could more easily access that button with your thumb, and you can still also get the far left button with your thumb without straining for that one either. So it was actually a shift from sort of underneath or between the number 1 and 2 buttons over a little bit to be right underneath the number 2 button. Not a major change. They literally cut it off and re-welded it into position, but it was done during the mock-up phase, right? While they were actually going through and implementing these changes, and the product was actually, or the lift assist was not on site yet, which was kind of a cool initiative, and I'll talk a little bit more about how they handled that later. Right, so an interesting example of how a great ergonomic control creates there's still one little thing to look at here, one little thing to explore a little bit more detail, because there were some potential for this to arrive on site with some ergonomic issues in place, which is of concern. Just going to pop my question box out here as I talk to you guys here. in case anybody has any questions they want to share with me. All right. So the next one I want to share, I've actually got a couple slides on because this was an interesting one and created some unique challenges. So this one, the client had gone ahead and had actually implemented what they thought was a great solution. So I'm going to back you up for just 1 second. So this is a brand new process at this plant. And so ultimately they are moving what I'm not even going to get into what it is or how it works or what it does, but ultimately they're moving a motor into 3 different workstations. So that it arrives at this line. They have to hook it up to this lift assist, move it to a sub-assembly station. They do their sub-assembly, then they lift it up again and move it over to the actual final assembly station, which is what you see in the picture on the left-hand side. The picture on the right is them doing some sub-assembly. And so what they originally had is that they had this lift assist and they had people standing on the floor. The problem that they experienced is that nobody could reach the lift assist, that the height of the conveyors and then the part and then the lift assist handle on top of a long hook, ultimately it meant that you had to be like 6'2" or higher in order to literally be able to reach it. I'm only 5'2". I can tell you there was no way I was going to be able to reach that lift assist handle. So it effectively didn't allow a huge chunk of their population be able to even perform this job. They literally couldn't because they could not reach the lift assist controls. So cool process. Interesting implementation, right? They implemented this lift assist, knew that they needed to actually address the ergonomic challenge of how are they going to move this new product from place to place. It was significantly heavier and larger than they'd experienced before, but got their lift assist in place, we're ready to roll, and realized, oh, dang it, we can't actually reach the lift assist controls. There's only 2 people in our plant that are 6'2" or taller that can actually do this. So they went ahead, instead of having an ergonomic evaluation done at this point when they had a problem, they went ahead and said, okay, we're going to install a platform. Then everybody will be able to reach, right? So they installed quite a large platform. I don't actually have the size in position, but it was 6 feet by 6 feet or bigger. So it was a very large platform, and they installed this platform and said, perfect, now everybody can reach the lift assist. But what you see in those pictures is that this is now the back postures required to work on the sub-assembly station and on the final assembly station. So yes, can people reach the lift assist now? For sure they can. However, this is clearly not good ergonomic posture from a back perspective. So in solving their reach issue, nobody thought about how this new 14, 15-inch platform was going to impact the actual assembly and work area or workstations that were present at this location. So it became a really interesting conversation. Now as we get involved at this stage, we've got a lift assist, we've got a platform, and they're not working. So they've already tried several ergonomic changes, and every time they try one, they're creating new problems. And so they were really struggling with what to do next. So they ultimately ended up with several different solutions because there were several different problems associated with this task. So my first picture, I'm going to take you through some of those examples and what the solutions were. So my first picture here on the left, if you want to look at that one, my first picture on the left, you can see this is the lift assist. Even with them working on the platform, this is the height and the angle their shoulder had to be at in order to move the part from station to station. So even with the platform, we still had really poor shoulder postures. So one of our recommendations and something that they work to implement is how do we activate this lift assist? Right now, the activation is occurring. If you can see there, the activation is occurring with his right hand on top of the lift assist, right? On top of the hook and the part and everything else, his right hand is way up there. And so our recommendation was to explore, can we look at a different type of pendant or some other device that can hang down and we can control the lift assist that way rather than having to use a handle above all the part and the hook and the actual mechanism and then way up top. That wasn't really a very feasible solution, whether we're standing on the ground or whether we're standing on the platform. And so that was part one, is can we implement some sort of pendant or hanging device in order to do that? And they worked to implement that. Part two, obviously, one of our challenges, people are bending over in this position. All of a sudden, lots of concern about backs, certainly about back injury and static back flexion, bending forward postures. And so our second recommendation is actually to reverse to ultimately reverse what they had implemented as their first solution. We said, you know what, you really need to take the platform out because they were unable to adjust the heights of their other intake conveyor or the extake, or the assembly stations. They were all sort of feeding another line. It wasn't possible to make those changes. So we said, if you can't change the height, you have to take the platform out because this is not an acceptable posture. So after they'd spent time, money, and energy to source and implement this platform, ultimately our solution was to take it away and really focus on fixing the lift assist, right? That's really where our root cause of a lot of our problems were. Let's focus on that. So this is the back posture as somebody is all of a sudden standing on the ground, working on that assembly station. You can see how much better our back position gets by doing that. And our third recommendation there is that if you can see the way this is designed, there is actually a 16-inch. So the hook there up to the end effector and up to the controls is approximately 16 inches. And so that is a lot of what I'm just going to describe as wasted space, right? That if I have to reach up to that top handle still, although they didn't go that route, these are things that we should be exploring. And they actually do need to still reach the handle because they have to control the movement a little bit, but not to the same degree they did before. And so we said, all this end effector pieces, why do they have to be 16 inches in length? Why can't we find some hook that is way shorter than this that does the exact same job, and we're able to effectively shorten the distance from the place that we would control the movement of the lift assist to where we would actually hook it up to the part or the motor that we need to move. And so those are the three things that they worked through in the end. But you can see how sort of a progression they had. Problem number one is they couldn't reach their lift assist. They went ahead and implemented a platform because then bang, you're going to be able to reach your lift assist, but without thinking about all the other implications about how the posture is going to be impacted when I'm now working 15 inches or 16 inches higher than I was before. And so they had to explore now all kinds of new problems. And ultimately this was all creating delays in getting their line up and running because they hadn't taken the time or didn't have the insight or the knowledge in order to be able to look forwards at what potential ergonomic challenges they were presenting or creating by implementing the platform. And in the end, we asked them to take the platform out and went back to standing on the floor. So they didn't actually gain anything. In fact, they lost money by going that route. So looking at different solutions and exploring more different solutions and being open to different solutions is probably a better strategy here. That they really were not excited about having to change the lift assist because they'd spent quite a bit of money on it. But in the end, it was by far the better ergonomic solution than looking at a platform. I threw in a few office examples today too, because I do think that's relevant. I don't know how many of us online are manufacturing related and how many of us have a lot of office folks here, and that's fine. So I just threw a few office in there because that sort of applies to everybody and is something we see all the time. So an example of something that happened actually just a couple months ago, we had an assessment or did an assessment of a whole bunch of workstations at an office location. And what ultimately we found is that consistently the desk height was too high. So, and that's true for a lot of folks. The desk height is often not the ideal working height. So people work on the desktop, but it is above their natural elbow height, which creates some other ergonomic challenges. So we ultimately said, you know what, your desk height is too high for almost everyone. Our recommendation would be that that ultimately you look at implementing a keyboard tray at maybe not everyone's workstation, but these are the 12 out of the 15 people we saw that would be high priority for a keyboard tray. And so what we got was we provide recommendations as to what keyboard tray they should include. And this is the picture that I got back. So the client sent me the picture and said, hey, we've got this on site. We're going to put these in at every workstation. We just want to double check with you before we do that these would be a suitable alternative to what you are recommending. And I'm super glad they asked because it would have been a perfect example of an ergonomic intervention that needs a big intervention if they hadn't asked. That these aren't adjustable keyboard trays. They are keyboard drawers. They just slide in and out. They're not very effective. They do lower the working height a little bit, but they can't be customized to a whole bunch of different users. So ultimately they asked and we said, ooh, I would really not recommend it. And this is because you can't adjust that to different working heights. You can adjust the one that we've recommended to different heights. So it solves your problem now. Everybody gets the keyboard set at the right height. If you have any turnover in staff, you can adjust the height to fit you or fit them as a new staff member sits down at that workstation. So it is absolutely not advised to go forwards with this keyboard tray. Even though you might have it, you're really going to spend your money and time installing them all, and then you're still going to have ergonomic issues and ultimately still change a bunch of them out for something that is adjustable to get people to the right height in the end anyways. So great news is that they asked the question, we were able to provide that feedback, and they said, oh, okay, good to know. We will order the new ones because that makes so much sense. We don't want to waste our time or energy or resources now installing something we're going to have to remove later, right? Which makes a lot of sense. Another office one that we have seen, see often, this one was because of an extreme example, is that, again, we had a client who was retrofitting and updating their office. They had actually already done this by the time they contacted us. They were looking for some training specifically because they had implemented all kinds of sit-stand workstations throughout their office, fully height adjustable desks. They had a brand new phone system, new monitors, etc. So they had really outfitted their workstation. But this was the chair that they had selected, right? It was like they got 95% of the way there, and then at the last second balked at the fact that a chair might cost you $800 to $1,200 per chair. And it's like, oh, these ones are good enough. And so ultimately, trying really hard to achieve good ergonomic setup, had thought through all kinds of great things, right? The sit stand was awesome. The new monitors they'd implemented were height adjustable, really good fit for a lot of people. The new phone system addressed some other ergonomic challenges that they were having, and it really addressed lots of different issues. But the last piece wasn't really the follow through they were looking for. So the selected chairs weren't really adjustable. They were pretty standard. They went up and down. The armrests obviously don't adjust. The lumbar support doesn't adjust. They had like a tilt lock mechanism, but I would describe them more as a boardroom chair than an office chair. And so ultimately, before we recommended that they do training, we said, you know what, I'm happy to do training for you. I think it's super beneficial and will totally work. However, before you do that, you may want to consider a chair that is more adjustable, because I can't adjust that to fit anybody. And so training people on how to sit and stand is great, but only if their seated position is really not bad, right, is really ideal for their setup as well. I can teach them how to adjust their chair. So they said they, again, came around. Obviously, they weren't excited about spending a bunch of extra money on some new chairs, but understood, and they'd already been seeing some reports of back discomfort and whatnot. And so ultimately went forward with an ergonomic change to chairs. They tried to work in waves, so it wasn't quite so overwhelming, but did ultimately make some changes to chairs before they started to implement some training initiatives, so that in the end, they had a great setup and had everybody educated on ergonomics and proper workstation layout. But in the beginning, they didn't have all the details yet. And so they were still missing that chair. And there were some more steps needed before we jumped in with training. Training would have been a miss at this point, right? You can't train people on how to properly set up your workstation if they can't adjust their chair, because it's such a key component of that. If we'd trained now, we would have had a serious ergonomic miss and probably created more problems than solved. The last one's actually an accommodation piece, and just ergonomic interventions can be grand. Well, actually, I have two more, but this one's actually an accommodation piece. And ergonomic interventions can be grand scale, right? They can be things we implement everywhere, but they can also be things that are intended for one individual. And so this one came up with a client that we had been doing an accommodation for an individual in an office. They had already taken a bunch of action steps. So we were going to do the assessment, but they had already implemented a new chair and a new keyboard and blah, blah, right? They had all these things. One of the pieces was this new sit-stand desk. And in theory, it was great, right? This person had been having some very complex issues and discomforts. And so the sit-stand desk was actually kind of an ideal solution. It gave them a lot of flexibility and movement opportunities, which was really exciting. But when we got there, what we found is that the challenge here is that this is not the desk they selected ultimately was not powered. It was a sort of, I'm going to call it manual. It's sort of pseudo manual. You don't crank it up. You pull that lever that I see me highlighted there. You squeeze it, and it actually, the desk will sort of float up with you have to provide some muscle effort to get it up, but it will move. You're not hauling it up entirely by yourself, but you are certainly assisting. And then when you need to push it down, you have to squeeze that lever again and apply force to the top of the desk. And it kind of like your office chair, it will slowly decrease in height. So it assists you in the movement, but certainly not all. And what we discovered here is twofold problems. Number one is that the distance, that handle is actually really hard to grab. If your hands are small, grabbing the top of the desk and grabbing the handle and squeezing it was very challenging because it is quite a ways from the desktop. And then challenge number two is that this specific employee, one of their discomforts or issues was shoulder and low back. And so what we found is that they physically were unable to actually adjust the desk height properly because they could maybe grab the handle, but then they had a really difficult time applying any kind of force to assist with the movement up or force to assist with the movement down. So ultimately, in the end, they'd spent money on a height adjustable desk, which was not actually solving the problems and was potentially increasing the risk here because this individual who was using the desk was trying to sit and stand, but couldn't easily generate the force, so was potentially increasing or putting her back and her shoulder at risk. So we looked at alternate desks that would be powered so that wouldn't be required. You press a button, it raises to the right height, and problem solved. It eliminated all the issues here, but ultimately they had really tried hard to implement the right solution, but again, missed just a little bit without thinking fully through what happens if we choose this option versus this option. What is the implication to the individual? Didn't have a chance or didn't try or ask or or it wasn't available to them to try it out ahead of time and see what it would feel like or how much work was involved to move it up and down. And so those things all sort of combine to ultimately a poor ergonomic solution for this individual until they were able to make that change to something that was fully powered and use this desk somewhere else for another purpose. But they did need to make that change, especially because it was an accommodation piece. So sometimes our ergonomic solutions, even for accommodations, aren't 100% upfront, and we need to keep tweaking and tinkering with those. So another one I want to share is something we talk about a lot, that sometimes we have temporary solutions at a workplace, right? Sometimes an employee ultimately comes up with a great solution at the workplace. And one of our ergonomic challenges is to figure out, A, is it a good solution? Number one is the question. B, does it defeat any safety concerns that I should be worried about? And then C, if it doesn't do any of those things, how can we maybe work to implement that? So the issue here is that these plastic parts fall off a conveyor into a bin. They need to be quality checked periodically. So every once in a while, someone comes over, picks up one of the pieces and does a quality inspection. And so the employee was tired of reaching to the back edge of the bin to retrieve the part because they had to pick the one that was just off the line. So they'd have to reach the back to retrieve the part. And they were tired of that. And they have to empty this bin periodically. So they ultimately folded a cardboard box upside down, sort of backwards. So it created a bit of a ramp to slide the parts forwards. So the real issue is that it was temporary, so not all staff were using it, and it needed to be replaced periodically, right? The cardboard box is not meant for this exactly, so it would wear down eventually and need to be replaced. And the solution really in this case was pretty simple. We need to evaluate whether it was a good ergonomic solution, and if in this case it was, we really liked it, as long as it wasn't going to create problems with overflowing of the bin, for example, and parts falling all over the floor, because that creates other ergonomic and or health and safety challenges. The solution here was simply to make it permanent. So look at, other than a box, what's lightweight that we can get that ramp sort of style, and can we implement that in all of our bins that it's relevant for? And so that was really the ergonomic solution to this process. The last one I want to talk about today is sort of on that administrative side. We do see a lot of ergonomic controls being implemented as administrative controls being implemented as an ergonomic change, which is totally feasible. And like I said, a lot of most ergonomic changes are implemented as engineering controls or administrative controls. So this would be an example of that admin control. And rotation can be a fabulous tool. It truly can. There's a lot of great advantages to it. We see a lot of benefits in terms of cross training, for example. So we have more staff trained to do all the different jobs at our facility, which is great. But there are some ergonomic challenges potentially to this. And so number one, or probably the actual real ergonomic concern, is every once in a while we have a client present to us who says, you know what, I have this job that I know is high risk. It's really difficult. We have injuries on it. We want to make sure we mitigate that risk. So we want to talk to you about building a job rotation in so that we can reduce the amount of time somebody's spending at the job. And the problem with that approach to that ergonomic approach, or that administrative approach to what is really an ergonomic problem that probably needs some engineering controls in terms of actually figuring out how we can reduce the risk or improve this job, is that sort of what's illustrated there, right? You've got 3 people. So let's say you're going to rotate 4 people through the job. That's your plan, right? You want to know which 4 people, and you're asking an ergonomist to help you with that. No problem. But you've got 3 people that are low risk and doing jobs that are relatively low risk. And then you've got 1 person doing a job that's high risk. And you want to expose that high risk person to less risk by rotating them out of that job. The real problem is that you actually rotate the other 3 people into the job. And so if you look at it sort of in a different perspective, yes, you reduce the risk for the high risk person, but you ultimately increase the risk for all 3 people who are low risk people, right? Who came from low risk positions. So what you end up is probably something in this style, right? You end up with 4 people who now have moderate risk rather than 1 person with high risk and 3 people with low. And so the concern is that if you look at sort of overall sort of grand scale risk that is present in your system, exposing 3 more people to that high risk job and increasing their risk from low to moderate actually overall increases your system risk. That 1 person who's doing the high risk jobs risk does go down, which is a positive for sure, but the other 3 people's risk goes up, and that's absolutely a negative. And so if you do it's not perfect system, but if you look at your overall system risk, you'll probably discover that your risk has actually gone up overall, and your likelihood of injury and therefore costs associated with those injuries actually has gone up. So it isn't always, rotation can be a very valuable tool, but it needs to be paired with engineering controls first. So rotation, we see it a lot where we get asked to look at a rotation or evaluate or build a rotation because they're having challenges with one job. And that's really not the ideal approach to a ergonomic challenge, right? We need to focus on engineering controls first, or we create other issues, which is increased overall system risk. So hopefully those examples make sense to you. I tried to pull some, relevant examples from a couple different industries here, so you get a sense of what we've been seeing and what challenges we see and crop up over time. But I think what I want to focus on for the last part today, let's not leave and focus on the doom and gloom and what went wrong. Let's focus on the getting it right part. So I want to talk about what you can do to make sure that you are getting it right at your workplace. The first thing I would encourage you to do is to include an ergonomist. And when I say that, I don't necessarily mean a consultant. It might be a consultant for you, but it might not be, right? Ultimately, what you really need is somebody with ergonomic experience and knowledge in your workplace. If that is somebody that you can train in-house to do that, right, through the training process, that's great. If you already have someone on your health and safety team that has that background, or maybe you hire someone specifically with that background into a health and safety role so that they can fulfill that need for your organization, then that is totally suitable, right? As long as we're getting an ergonomic eye on the different processes and tasks and interventions that we're looking at, then you should be addressing a lot of your ergonomic risk that way. You may choose to have an in-house ergonomist, right? We do have some clients that use us in that manner. So in particular, it happens more often with manufacturers than others, where one of our team members will sit on their joint health and safety committee, right? Or their ergonomics team, and we'll be with them at basically every meeting, and then on site maybe 1 or 2 times in between those meetings in order to provide consultation or to review something that is in progress and provide an update or a report or whatnot. But that is an option, right? To bring someone in on a regular basis strategically to address the ergonomic needs that are present on an ongoing basis and provide that ergonomic eye in your committee. You could train someone in-house to do that. You could hire someone that has that experience or background. You may already have someone that has that experience or background. You could train an ergonomics team to be those people for you. So you have multiple people at your work site that could fill that need if needed. So those are sort of 2 options. And then what we have a lot of our clients do is just call us in on a project base, right? So they have one project that they have ongoing. They know they're implementing a new piece of equipment or having difficulty with a specific process, or all of a sudden having a lot of shoulder injuries, like our one client where we talked about the cart way back at the beginning of the webinar today, right? They brought us in to look at a very specific project or conduct a very specific project to try and figure out what the ergonomic issue is and what the solutions might be. And really, the message here is that you probably need to have somebody with ergonomic experience of some kind in your back pocket, right? You need to have that resource available to you so that you know who to call if you're having a problem, whether it's an in-house resources or external resource. It doesn't matter as long as you know who that person is going to be as you move forwards, and that you know and understand when to reach out, right? That when do I get that person involved in the conversation? And that might be your biggest hurdle, is trying to figure out, like, if you have an engineering team in house that builds and implement new lines, maybe builds a new design of a new lab or a new room. Well, now you have to figure out how to make sure that they're including the ergonomic specialist into the conversation at the right intervals. And that might be one of the biggest challenges you have to overcome, is figuring out how you navigate this. When and how do I include that ergonomic perspective? Because that will help to ward off some of the issues, because our job is to pinpoint some of the challenges that people experience, right? That they've create problems before they would like. Some specific examples of where ergonomics might be included, right? Things that you might actually, where you might tuck us in, is looking for ergonomic intervention at the design end. So this one is a little more high level, isn't always something that, for example, your ergonomics team may not be qualified or capable of handling that. But certainly that is something that can be really valuable, because the point of this is to design out the ergonomic issues before they arrive on site. So you're hired a company to build you a new assembly line. That's awesome. Ask an ergonomist, ask them to include ergonomists. It doesn't have to be you hiring the ergonomist. That can be a requirement of your tender, that an ergonomic assessment is done on the line, or you get ergonomic sign off from an ergonomist as part of the design process, so that they are getting ergonomic eye on all of their design and at different stages of their design and implementation. So the real goal is to do it from a design or a before it's here kind of perspective. My slide got rearranged here a little bit, but it should start with design phase, then mock-up, then installation. I don't know what happened there, but ultimately that's the design phase. What I just talked about there is looking at it when you've got a diagram with all kinds of specs on it. How have we considered ergonomics at this point? There's a lot we can do at that stage. Now, that said, the example I gave with my handle control, where I was showing you how my hand could barely reach the button, those are things that, for example, a client we have does this. They go through the 3 phases. They have a design phase, or they do an ergonomic assessment at the design phase of a new building or piece of equipment. Then they do an assessment hopefully in a mock-up phase, if that's feasible. And then they do an assessment again at post-installation at the actual facility, right? And so at the design phase, we're looking at all the different pieces. But we know that things keep changing, right? As somebody goes to build something, they realize it doesn't work quite the way they intended. They redesign it a little bit, they tweak it. That's normal as part of the design process. So it is not uncommon to have a design phase that an ergonomist signs off on and says, yep, everything's good. And then there's been a little tweak or change or some minor adjustments because a piece of equipment they ordered is a little bigger than what they thought it was going to be, or a little taller or something. And so those little tweaks can mean that you get it on site and it's not exactly perfect or not exactly what you were looking for. And so in that case, a mock-up is ideal if you can get access to that, right? Having somebody review an actual mocked up or partially built or fully built piece of equipment. So my handle design example, we discovered that during the mock-up phase. So we'd done a design review, we'd looked at the full design, and then we did an in-depth dive on the handle. And then they actually built it, and we got in there and said, whoa, this is bigger than we thought it was going to be. Let's take a deeper look at this handle. And all of a sudden the mock-up was actually where we caught the handle size issues. And so when it arrived on site, the handle size had been fixed, the lift assist had functioned because they'd tested it, and so it was all functioning properly. So there was minimal issues at the installation phase. Right? So a nice way to just think about your design review is what stages should an ergonomist be involved at least once, if not a couple times during the design phase. If you have a mock-up, that's great. We'd love to be involved there, and then get that final sign-off as part of your pre-start, for example. You could have an ergonomic sign-off as part of that process, just to make sure that ergonomics is built in. And the mock-up picture I have there is actually an example of a mock-up we did recently. I didn't talk about that one, but my colleague Alex is working with a company that's building a like a ticket counter at a train station. And so that is the mock-up that she was just on site. You can see they have a keyboard tray to enter information. You can't see the full picture, but that's like a scanner that's listed there. She's got a cash counter on the left-hand side. So she'd seen all the designs before, but actually getting to touch, feel, see how people are going to actually interact with this. Where is the customer going to be? Where is the individual working there going to be? How are they going to interact with the customer? And really getting to dive into it and put your hands on it sometimes opens up all kinds of new information that you didn't have originally, or new challenges that maybe you couldn't see or plan for in the actual design element. So it's a great opportunity if you can get a mock-up. It's good to do it even for an office, right? We see some clients that are like, you know what, we're going to retrofit our whole office. We have brought in 2 mocked up workstations and we're going to set them up in our front lobby, and staff are going to go through, they're going to try them out. They're going to provide us with feedback. Those are great tools. You get a lot of information up front, and you can make your tweaks before you buy 50 of them and implement them at the workstations as part of the change process. So there's lots of ways that you can build a mock-up into your process to help prevent some of those ergonomic issues long-term. Another good one to think about is a purchasing standard. This is one that we get asked about intermittently. It's not as common as it should be. And I think especially for office, it should be a very common process, right? That if you have any equipment that's standardized, or you have equipment that you order semi-regularly, for example, these are things that you might want to evaluate for ergonomic effectiveness. What are they actually doing? Do they achieve any ergonomic goal here? And so it's great for the office because you can look at things like, okay, I want to set a standard for everybody in my organization can order products as they need, right? Any manager can order a product for one of their staff members, but they must order off our list unless there's some accommodation need that necessitates it, right? So I have pre-selected 2 different mice. I've pre-selected 2 different keyboards. I've pre-selected a monitor that we want everybody to have. Everybody gets the same chair or one of 2 different models in this color fabric. And like, you can set a lot of parameters in here to make sure that people are successful in getting products that you actually approve. They maintain the aesthetics of the facility, and they actually have some ergonomic benefit, rather than letting people sort of take a stab in the dark at what from Staples they happen to like or think looks nice, which is honestly what does happen a lot. So it's a nice tool you can use to help control some of those ergonomics, so that you hopefully don't get a bunch of new equipment on site that is not ergonomics and not helping your staff, and ultimately that you end up wasting money on replacing. It can also be good for some manual material handling equipment, specifically when you think about like height adjustable carts. That's just an example, or a dolly. What is like your standard? So a height adjustable cart, what range does it need to be able to move through? How does the height adjustability work? Is it electric? Is it pump? There's a lot of different features there that you want to consider. And it doesn't mean that one is better or worse. It's just how you're using them and what's best for your facility. And so you want to evaluate that. And you could set up some purchasing standards. And the best thing about a purchasing standard is you might also be able to navigate or negotiate some good pricing, right? Because you might say, you know what, I'm going to work exclusively with you for all of our keyboards and mice. And so what's the best price that I can get? And, we're going to order 100 a year, for example. So what kind of pricing can I get? Sometimes when you're doing that, you can negotiate some better prices as well. Other times you might want to think about it. We see it a lot with municipalities and other folks that use heavy equipment. Some requirements for adjustability and seating, for example, can be a really valuable tool that's, going out in an RFP or a tender process, that it's not just the cheapest product that arrives on site, that we've set some specific criteria. Our chair needs to be air, needs to have air lumbar support, needs to have 3 bladders in the lumbar, not just one. It needs to have an armrest. There's a whole bunch of features you can look at to basically require that people bidding on your process are offering you a product that actually meets some good ergonomic standards, is going to be good for your staff. So that's another place that you might think about looking at purchasing standards, is how do we build those into our tender processes to make sure that we're getting good quality ergonomic products when they arrive on site. And the last thing I want you to think about today is just the process of participatory ergonomics. We talk about it a lot, but it is something that we still don't see often enough in our practices. Involving workers in the change process is important. We want to talk to them about discomforts and challenges they're having with the current setup. You want to involve them in the discussion about what the proposed solutions are going to be. and you want to ask for their input about what the solutions you think are you're going to implement as you narrow down to the one or two you think are going to be best, presenting that to the staff and getting their input. They work with it every day. They are likely to foresee some potential challenges that other people maybe cannot, who don't use that equipment all the time. And so if you can do that, that's certainly ideal. And it's going to give you the best insight, especially if you have a good team that's able to provide that kind of insight for you. And then, like I mentioned, it's always great if you can get a mock-up or a trial, right? Before you buy 50 different grinders, for example, for a workplace, like trialing one and making sure that it serves the needs of your group and isn't causing any ergonomic challenges, and you get feedback from the staff who are trialing it and testing it, and then you maybe make tweaks or order a different product because it's not working, or you get approval that, yep, this works great, we totally want to move forwards with this one. Then you've gotten some buy-in, which is nice, and because change is always hard. And then ultimately you also likely get some further insight that this product is actually going to work and solve the ergonomic issue. So those are the things that I think you can be doing to head off at the past some of your ergonomic challenges. So before something arrives on site that is less than ideal from an ergonomic perspective, if we think about doing some design reviews, maybe some mock-ups, using participatory ergonomics and other strategies in order to minimize our risk here, you are likely to see a decrease in the issues that you are inheriting or arriving in on site. Now, that said, as I started this webinar today, for those of you who joined late, I did say I want to talk briefly about what we're offering at the moment for the coronavirus and what our clients are struggling with. So we're already hearing from some clients about they've sent a bunch of employees home. They've got a bunch of staff working from home. They've been home for the last week or so, maybe 2 weeks, depending on when they started that process. And ultimately, they are already hearing from some folks that they are having some discomforts, and maybe even some people have been reporting injuries already at home. And so that's something that we are hearing from our clients already. That's something we anticipated was coming, sending a bunch of people home without a lot of direction or input on how they can set up their home workstation to best fit them. It's a unique system. They don't have keyboard trays and fancy chairs and monitors that go up and down. They likely have a laptop and maybe a keyboard or mouse, right? So we want to make sure that we're educating them on the best strategies for putting everything together so that they ultimately are achieving the best ergonomic positioning that they possibly can while they're working from home. And so we've put together a 1 hour webinar, which is about a 45 minute content delivery and about 15 minutes of question and answer for your staff that we are available to deliver. You can have up to 100 people register from your organization. If that's something that you want to explore, then you can certainly reach out to us and let us know. We can get you the pricing on that. It is really low. We've priced it with a really low price point because we really just want to make sure people are getting the help that they need and that organizations aren't seeing a huge spike in ergonomic injuries because people are working at home in poor postures. And so we've priced it really low for 100 folks. So we want to make sure that you get access to that if that's something you think your group needs. And then if you have some folks maybe who had some very specific discomforts or who had perhaps an ergonomic injury in the office before they went home and started working from home, those folks might need more support than just some education, right? They may need some more touch points and a check-in with an ergonomist to make sure that they've been able to apply the webinar practices in their office so that wherever they're working when they're at home, trying to help them make sure that they reduce their risk as much as possible, because our belief is that they're probably the highest risk employees you've got right now. They've gone home. They're not they don't have the fancy keyboard and chair they were provided with after their ergonomic assessment in the office. And so working on a kitchen chair when you've got a back injury is potential for, or I would say not even potential, it's very likely that they're going to re-injure or re-aggravate their existing injury as a result. So we are offering some services to help you try and combat that. If you are looking for any help, let us know. We can certainly talk to you and get you some pricing on that webinar, any follow-up assessments that you want to do in partnership with the webinar, or any one-on-one assessments that are virtual assessments independent of that. So I just want to make sure everybody knows that those are out there. If you do need that help, it is available to you. Just let us know and we can talk about what that would look like for you, what your best practices might be, and what your strategy is. Also, to go along with that, we have some free downloads, so I can certainly share those with you today. Anybody who registered, I'll send those out so you've got access to them. One is a download for for a tip sheet for your staff, so you can send that out immediately. It's a free resource, so hopefully folks can get themselves a little bit better set up with that free resource. And we also have one for managers and staff as well about how to manage some of the things that may be coming down the pipeline from an ergonomic perspective. So that said, I wanted to open up the floor for questions today. I haven't seen any pop up as the session has been going on. So if you have any questions about any of the strategies or any of the ergonomic interventions, or maybe even an ergonomic challenge you're experiencing you want to ask about, now would be the time to do that. And I will be available here for the next several minutes if you want to type one in.